Imagine it's May 12th, 2007. You are a 22-year-old communications graduate living in Columbus, Ohio. You just walked across a stage in a rented gown, took a rolled piece of paper from a dean you barely recognized, and smiled for a photograph your mother will frame and hang in the hallway of the house you grew up in. It is a Saturday. The sky is clear. You feel, genuinely, that the hard part is over. Your apartment is small, but yours. You have a used car that still starts most mornings. You have a job offer waiting at a mid-sized marketing firm, starting at $31,000 a year. And you have something else, something you signed your name to 4 years ago without fully reading, because everyone told you it was just part of the process. You have $43,000 in student loan debt. Monthly payments begin in November. You're not worried. Why would you be? Everyone you know has the same thing. The economy is booming. The news says so. House prices are rising. The stock market is rising. Everything, it seems, is rising. Except one thing. And that one thing you will not notice for another 14 months. If you have ever wondered why an entire generation of Americans seem stuck, unable to buy homes, unable to start families, unable to build the kind of wealth their parents took for granted, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is not a political opinion. It is a pattern that has played out across multiple countries, across multiple decades, with the same actors and the same ending. And right now, in the United States, that pattern is further along than almost anyone is willing to say out loud. If this kind of historical clarity is useful to you, subscribing takes 2 seconds, and it costs nothing. And it might be the most valuable 2 seconds you spend a day. This video is about $1.84 trillion. That is the total amount of student loan debt currently sitting on the books in the United States as of late 2025. To give you a sense of what that number means, it is larger than the entire gross domestic product of Australia. It is larger than the economy of Spain. It is owed by 43.6 million Americans, with an average balance of $38,000 per borrower. And as of 2025, 1 in 4 of those borrowers is delinquent. Delinquent means they have missed payments, that their credit scores are falling, and that the government has begun sending their accounts to collections. Not 1 in 10, 1 in 4. That is 3 times the pre-pandemic rate. And the collections machine, paused during the COVID years, has been switched back on. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. What looks like a personal finance problem is not a personal finance problem. It is a structural economic trap. It was built slowly, piece by piece, over 50 years. And the mechanism that built it is the same mechanism that has broken economies before. To understand it, we need to start at the beginning. Think of the student loan system as a water pipe with a broken valve. In 1965, the United States Congress passed the Higher Education Act. The goal was simple and genuinely good. Make college accessible to every American, regardless of family income. To do this, the government began guaranteeing student loans. That means if a student borrowed money and could not pay it back, the government would cover the loss for the bank. Banks love this. 0 risk for them, and so they lent freely. In 1972, under the Nixon administration, Congress created a new entity called the Student Loan Marketing Association, which became known as Sallie Mae. Its official purpose was to increase the supply of money available for student lending. More liquidity, which just means more accessible money in the system, meant more students could borrow, which meant more students could go to college, which seemed at the time like an unambiguous good. But here is what the broken valve does. When you make it very easy to borrow money for something, the price of that thing almost always goes up. Think about it this way. Imagine a town with 1 bakery. The bread costs $2 a loaf. Now the government announces that it will lend everyone in town as much money as they want to buy bread, at low interest, with no questions asked. What do you think happens to the price of bread? The baker, knowing that everyone now has essentially unlimited money to spend, raises the price. First to $4, then to $8, then to $20. Because he can, because the money is always there. This is what economists call the Bennett hypothesis. In 1987, then Secretary of Education William Bennett argued in a New York Times op-ed that federal student aid was simply being absorbed by colleges as higher tuition. In other words, every dollar the government pumped into student lending was a dollar universities raised their prices by. The evidence has largely supported him. Between 1980 and 2020, the average cost of a college education, including tuition, fees, room and board, increased by 169% after adjusting for inflation. Not total, adjusted for inflation. The real cost of going to college in America almost tripled in 40 years, while the wages that graduates could earn when they left barely moved. The pipe was pumping water in, and someone had quietly sealed the other end shut. Now here is where it gets interesting. Because this mechanism did not only play out in America, and the places where it played out most severely give us a very clear window into what comes next. This brings us directly to the first major case study. And it is not in Chile or South Korea or Australia. It begins right here in the United States inside the offices of a company called Sallie Mae, and the story of what happened when the pipe was not just broken, but deliberately redirected. By the late 1990s, Sallie Mae had transformed. It had started as a government-backed lender, but through a series of legislative changes, it became a fully private corporation by the early 2000s. It was now a publicly traded company. It had shareholders. It had quarterly earnings targets. And it had something extraordinarily valuable: access to tens of millions of young Americans who needed to borrow money and who, critically, could not escape that debt even if their lives fell apart. Here is the fact that most people do not know. In 1976, a provision was quietly added to federal law making it nearly impossible to discharge, which means eliminate, student loan debt through bankruptcy. Think about what that means. If you run up $50,000 in credit card debt and your life collapses, you can go bankrupt and eventually start over. If you run up $50,000 in student loans and your life collapses, the debt follows you. It accrues interest. It can garnish your wages, meaning the government takes money directly from your paycheck before you even see it. It can intercept your tax refund. It does not go away. This made student loan debt the single most secure financial asset in America. From a lender's perspective, it was perfect. And Sallie Mae, and the industry it seeded, made the most of it. By the mid-2000s, an entire ecosystem had grown up around student debt. For-profit colleges, schools that are run as businesses to generate profit, not as educational institutions, discovered that they could recruit aggressively, promise credentials they could not deliver, and collect federal student loan money with almost no accountability. Between 2011 and 2014, students at Corinthian colleges, a for-profit chain operating dozens of campuses across the United States, borrowed an estimated $568 million in private loans alone on top of their federal borrowing. Corinthian had been found to be lying to students about job placement rates, manipulating employment statistics, and partnering with predatory lenders. In September 2014, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau sued Corinthian for running what it called a predatory lending scheme. The company collapsed the following year in 2015. 200,000 students were left holding worthless degrees and real debt. ITT Technical Institute, another for-profit chain with over 130 campuses across the country, shut down in September 2016. $3.9 billion in debt was eventually canceled for 208,000 of its former students. The for-profit college industry had, by that point, grown to a $35 billion enterprise, much of it built on borrowed federal money and broken promises. And the debt those students held, that debt was not canceled for years. Many of them waited a decade. Some never saw relief at all. Meanwhile, Sallie Mae spun off a separate servicing arm in 2014, named Navient. A servicer is simply the company that manages your loan. They collect your payments, handle your paperwork, and guide you through your options. Navient was eventually found to have steered more than 1 million borrowers away from income-driven repayment plans, which are plans that limit how much you pay based on what you earn, and instead pushed them into a strategy called forbearance, which just means temporarily pausing payments while interest continued to pile up. In 2022, Navient settled with 39 state attorneys general, agreeing to cancel $1.7 billion in predatory private student loans. In 2024, the company was permanently banned from the federal student loan servicing market. But by then, the damage to a generation of borrowers had already been done. Here is something I want you to think about before we go further. Between 1965 and today, the federal government created a system that made it easier and easier to borrow, harder and harder to escape that debt, and essentially profitable for private companies to make that debt as large and as permanent as possible. At what point does a system designed to help people get an education become a system designed to extract wealth from people who wanted an education? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Because this exact mechanism has played out before, in different countries, with different names, but with the same result. And the country that shows it most clearly is one you might not expect: Chile. In 2011, something happened in Santiago that shook the Chilean government to its core. Hundreds of thousands of students took to the streets. The protests lasted not for days or weeks, but for months, stretching into 2012 and 2013 in what became known as the Chilean Winter. The students were not protesting a single law or a single tuition hike. They were protesting a system. Chile had, since the 1980s, operated one of the most privatized higher education systems in the world. Under the Pinochet regime, following the advice of a group of economists trained at the University of Chicago, Chile had dramatically reduced public funding for universities and pushed the cost of education onto students and families. By 2011, Chile had one of the lowest levels of public funding for higher education anywhere in the developed world. 350,000 Chileans were holding student loans from private financial institutions. These were not soft government loans with income-based repayment options. These were commercial loans from banks at market interest rates. A student from a working-class family who wanted a university degree was essentially taking on the same kind of financial product as a small business loan. The Economist described the protests as the result of, quote, one of the world's lowest levels of public funding for higher education and some of the longest degrees in the world. Students were spending 5 to 6 years in programs that were supposed to last 4. Costs were compounding. Debt was compounding. And the jobs waiting on the other side were not paying enough to cover it. The Chilean government, under President Sebastián Piñera, initially offered reform packages that protesters rejected as cosmetic. The movement gave birth to a generation of political leaders. Giorgio Jackson, one of the student protest leaders, later became a government minister. Camila Vallejo, another protest leader, rose to become a cabinet minister. The grievance had been real, specific, and measurable. And it was about a simple, broken promise. You told us a degree would be worth the debt. It was not. The Chilean case matters because it shows what happens when educational debt intersects with a labor market that cannot absorb graduates. When the debt cannot be justified by the income it generates, the system does not just become a financial burden. It becomes a social and political crisis. This leads to the second part of this story, South Korea. If Chile shows us what educational debt does when the system is openly privatized, South Korea shows us what it does when the system is nominally public but culturally coercive. South Korea has one of the highest rates of university attendance in the world. Degrees are not just encouraged there. They are, in many sectors of the economy and society, effectively mandatory for social standing, for marriage prospects, for employment by the country's massive corporate conglomerates known as chaebols. The result is a system where young Koreans borrow to attend universities, often highly competitive ones, only to enter a labor market that is dominated by a small number of large companies with very limited hiring capacity. By recent reports, South Korea's student loan debt has surpassed 2 trillion won. Youth employment declined for 32 consecutive months. More than 60% of young Koreans hold college degrees or higher. Yet unemployment and what economists call NEET rates, young people who are not in employment, education, or training, remain stubbornly elevated. During South Korea's financial crisis in 1998, the youth unemployment rate surged to 12.2%. The parallels are not identical, but the engine is the same. A society pushes its young people into expensive credential programs. The labor market cannot absorb them. The debt remains. And the system that was supposed to lift them up becomes the anchor around their necks. Now observe what is happening in the United States through this same lens. As of the most recent data, approximately 41% of recent American college graduates are working in jobs that do not require a college degree. They are not unemployed. They are underemployed, working as baristas, as retail staff, as call center agents, while carrying an average of $38,000 in student loan debt. The degree was supposed to be the key. For 4 out of 10 recent graduates, it opened a door they could have walked through without the debt. Now look at all three together: the United States in the 2000s, Chile in 2011, South Korea over the past decade. 3 completely different countries, 3 completely different political systems, 3 completely different cultures, the same mechanism, easy or coercive access to educational debt, degrees that cost more than the labor market values them, an escape hatch, bankruptcy, debt discharge, forgiveness, that is either closed or nearly impossible to reach, and a generation of young people who did everything they were told to do and found themselves worse off than their parents because of it. Most people will never know what you now know about how this machine was built and how it runs in countries across the world. Most people will keep trusting that if you work hard, borrow responsibly, and get a degree, the system rewards you. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe, because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks, the part about who actually pays the price and who walks away fine. The history of every financial distortion, and a distortion is simply what happens when a price is pushed far away from its real value by artificial forces, follows a predictable sequence when it comes to who gets hurt. At the top of the list, in the student debt crisis, are not the wealthiest borrowers. They have resources, they have family support, they have lawyers. At the top of the list are the people in the middle. The first-generation college students who were told a degree was their ticket out, the working-class kids who attended for-profit schools because a traditional university felt out of reach, and an admissions officer at a Corinthian campus or an ITT tech told them this was their chance. The single parents who went back to school in their 30s to try to improve their earning power, and who now carry debt that is garnishing, taking directly from, their paychecks while they approach retirement age. Here is a specific pattern the historical record makes clear. When student loan payments resumed in October 2023, after a more than 3-year pause that had been put in place during the COVID pandemic, The Federal Reserve had tracked delinquency rates falling from 11.6% to as low as 2.3% during the pause. When payments came back, delinquency rates did not just climb, they surged. By 2025, 1 in 4 borrowers was delinquent, a rate 3 times higher than before the pandemic. More than 9 million borrowers faced having their accounts sent to collections. Collections on student loan debt in 2025 means wage garnishment. It means tax refund seizure. It means credit score damage that blocks access to housing, car loans, and small business financing. Bloomberg Economics estimated that student loan defaults could reduce consumer spending in America by up to $63 billion per year. Consumer spending drives approximately 70% of the entire United States economy. When $63 billion gets pulled out of the hands of people who would have spent it on rent, groceries, cars, and restaurants, that is not just a personal problem, that is a structural economic wound. And the people who feel it sharpest are the ones who can least absorb it. The 60% of millennials who say student debt delayed them from buying a home. The researchers who found that every additional $1,000 in student loan debt reduces the monthly probability of getting married by 2%. The young couples who are delaying or forgoing children because they cannot afford the combination of debt service, rent, and childcare. The economic ripple effects of those decisions, fewer first-time homebuyers, fewer weddings, fewer births, are not abstract. They flow directly into falling demand for housing construction, wedding services, baby products, pediatric medicine, primary schools. The rot from student debt is not in one beam. It is in the whole structure of consumer-driven economic growth. And here is the part that almost never gets discussed. The people who are not hurt, the universities themselves. In 2025, the endowments, which are the investment funds held by wealthy universities at schools like Harvard and Yale, are still worth tens of billions of dollars. The administrators, the facilities directors, the marketing departments that recruit students, the loan servicers who earn fees on every payment, none of them bear any of the risk. The risk sits entirely with the student, a 19-year-old who has never managed a budget in their life, who is being asked to make a $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 financial decision, often based on the advice of schools and servicers with enormous financial incentives to push them toward the largest possible loan. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it in time to make different choices than the system has already chosen for you. If this channel helps you look at the world more clearly, not through the lens of politics or ideology, but through the cold, honest lens of historical pattern, then subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. It costs nothing. And it might change everything. Now this brings us to the question that every serious study of historical financial crises eventually asks, not who got hurt, but what did the people who came through it relatively intact have in common? What was different about them? The historical record, across the student debt crisis and the broader economic dislocations it has produced, shows that those who navigated this period with the least damage largely shared several characteristics. It is critical to say clearly that this is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. What follows is simply what the data and the historical records show about patterns of resilience. The first characteristic is specificity. The borrowers who came through this period in the strongest financial position tended to be those who chose their credentials with precise attention to labor market outcomes, not with vague aspirations toward general knowledge. In practical terms, this means nurses and engineers who had clear salary trajectories and employer demand fared far better than communication graduates or fine arts graduates who took on similar debt for dramatically less earning power. The correlation between debt load and likely earnings is now well documented. Students who made decisions at 18 and 19 based on that correlation, even imperfectly, were almost uniformly better positioned than those who did not. The second characteristic is urgency. The historical record shows that those who prioritized debt reduction above nearly every other financial decision in their first years of work recovered the fastest. This is counterintuitive, which means it goes against what most people naturally assume, because every financial advisor will tell you that investing early produces compound returns. But compound interest works in both directions. A borrower who spends their first 5 years post-graduation paying aggressively against a loan at 7% interest is not just eliminating a payment. They are eliminating the compounding, not the interest growing on interest, that quietly doubles and triples a balance over time. The people who treated their student debt like a fire in their kitchen, not like a manageable background hum, came out the other side far faster. The third characteristic is institutional skepticism. Those who avoided for-profit institutions entirely avoided the worst of the predatory lending practices that trapped hundreds of thousands of Americans in worthless credentials and inescapable debt. This is harder to say clearly without sounding judgmental, because many of the people who attended Corinthian colleges or ITT Tech did so because no one in their family had ever navigated a college application process, and a recruiter with a script told them exactly what they needed to hear. But the pattern in the data is unmistakable. The institutions that recruited the hardest, promised the most, and made borrowing the easiest were almost uniformly the ones that delivered the least. Across the United States, Chile, South Korea, and Australia, the same principle held. When access to debt is made frictionless and the institution profiting from your borrowing has no skin in the game, no consequences if you fail, be very careful about how much you trust their advice about how much you should borrow. Now we return to where we began. Columbus, Ohio, May of 2007. The young woman in the rented gown, holding a rolled piece of paper with $43,000 of debt starting its clock in November. By October of 2008, the economy had collapsed. The marketing firm that hired her was laying off staff. Her $31,000 salary evaporated in a restructuring. She deferred her loans, meaning she asked to pause payments temporarily, and moved back in with her parents, as millions of her peers did. The interest on her deferred loans continued accumulating. By the time she found stable work again in 2011, her $43,000 had grown to over $51,000 due to interest, despite her having never missed a scheduled payment by choice. She did not buy a house in her mid-20s. She did not buy one in her early 30s either, because the student debt was counted against her borrowing power. She did not have children until 37, not because she did not want them earlier, because the numbers did not work. Her story is not exceptional. It is median. It is, statistically, the middle of the American experience for the generation that graduated between 2004 and 2012. And the generation graduating now faces an even steeper set of numbers in an economy where collection notices are already going out to 9 million households and where 1 in 4 borrowers cannot make a payment. The pattern is not new. The warning has been visible for years. A system built on guaranteed money flowing into any institution willing to accept it, with risk carried entirely by the borrower and none by the institution or the lender, is a system designed to extract, not to educate. That is the historical verdict, not a prediction. A verdict rendered by the record of what happened to real people in real places. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will scroll past it. Most people will keep assuming that the system works the way it was described to them when they were 18 years old. But if one person in your life, a younger sibling, a child, a friend about to sign a loan agreement for a school they barely researched, needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.